What happens when classrooms start emptying out, budgets shrink, and communities feel the strain? Today, on a special episode of the Empowered Learning Podcast, we're diving headfirst into one of education's most pressing crises, declining enrollment. Joined by an expert panel including economists, education advocates, and community leaders, we unpack the complex realities behind shifting demographics, school funding shortfalls, and innovative solutions that could revitalize our schools and neighborhoods.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Bennett. I am the host of the Empowered Learning Podcast, and I will serve as your moderator today. We thank you so much for joining us as we discuss the impacts of declining enrollment in our communities. We have a phenomenal panel of guests that are going to speak on their areas of expertise and just have an awesome beginning of a dialogue that will hopefully lead towards some significant and meaningful change. So again, like I said, my name is Andy Bennett. I am a Colorado native. I was born and raised in Cortez, Colorado. I got my master's at Adams State College. I know ASU, you think of Adams State or maybe Arizona State, but Adams State College when I went there. And for about 10 years, I worked in Colorado schools as a teacher, administrator, coach, lots of different things. And for the last 15 years, I've owned an educational technology company called Interactive Learning, where we empower the future of education. And the reason I'm here and talking to you right now is I also have the Empowered Learning Podcast, which I'll share you a little bit about. One other thing that I think is worth mentioning is I also have two boys in high school right now. So I come at this from a very unique angle, shall we say, of being in education in the past, now outside of it, but also being very invested in the success and the betterment of Colorado education. So really quickly, I'll tell you just a little snapshot of what the Empowered Learning Podcast is all about. We are starting season 2 next week, and this will be a big part of this. It will be releasing this, but we talk about education, leadership, technology, just inspirational stories, and just a vision of brighter future. We have a lot of different guests. I'll show you a couple of those in a second, but everything from educators to founders, creators, visionaries, CEOs. Here are just a few of our guests. My good friend, Colonel Barrow, Dr. Lopez Sonchar. She was a former teacher with me. Justin Bader is the director of the Principal Center. He's a phenomenal person and does a lot of great things in education. Tommy Sue Cox is a personal friend of mine, and she was a longtime principal up in the Fort Collins area. Dr. Scott Cooper served in multiple different roles. Andy Smith, and then you might recognize some of these guys as well. George Welsh has been in Colorado schools for a very long time, and this handsome fellow right here, Daniel Archuleta. So those are just a few of the 32 guests that I've had thus far, and we're starting season 2 right around the corner here. So if you are looking for a new podcast and looking to be challenged and meeting some new people, I would welcome you to join that. There is my email, podcast@intlearn.com, or you can text or call me on my cell phone, 970-739-2229. Okay. We're done with that. I tried to get through that as quickly as possible because that's not why you're here. You are here to hear from people much smarter than I about a very pressing issue. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda, and then we're going to dive right in, and we'll go just straight down the line of our agenda here. So we're going to start off with Elizabeth Garner talking about population data. We'll switch over to Lisa Wheel about school funding. Then we'll go over to Clarence Burton Jr. talking about declining enrollment and school closure policies, declining enrollment on the Western Slope from Andrea, and then over to Nicholas Martinez talking about the community involvement and impact, collective impact and community involvement by Joel Newton, and then Daniel will wrap things up with a community-led community impact model. Throughout each one of these, if there is time in between, you can imagine having 60 minutes to get through all of this stuff. There's not going to be a lot of windows, but as things come up, we will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions of one of the panelists, please put in the name of the panelist that you would like to ask the question to. And if we have time in between these, we will ask that. Otherwise, we do have some Q&A at the end of that. So that is what we are in store for. We thank you again for spending a little bit of time with us, either live or during the recorded session. So without further ado, let us jump right in. Our first guest is Elizabeth Garner. Elizabeth Garner has over 30 years of experience analyzing population and economic trends in Colorado. Elizabeth has traveled the state talking with Coloradoans about social and economic conditions that are brought about by population shifts. She applies an understanding of demographic trends to change in a range of areas, including the state's economy, workforce, education, housing, migration, and rural populations. Elizabeth's most recent focus has been on Colorado's migration, housing supply and demand, and aging. Elizabeth is a former state demographer for Colorado and is currently consulting in the same subject area. Elizabeth is an economist and received her BA in business at the University of San Diego and her master's in agriculture and resource economics at CSU. Elizabeth was born and raised in Colorado. So without further ado, Elizabeth, please share with us.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. And I am going to share my screen. Again, I want to thank you for having me. And I think that this will be really interesting in terms of looking at where we're going in terms of population to understand what's happening with this kind of school age population groups. I'm going to see if I can make my thing go forward. Maybe we'll do it this way. All right. Can you see that? A little bit, right? Okay.
That'll work.
So it's important to understand what's going on in terms of total population change. One that we have seen is that births are down and deaths are up. So population growth is slowing. Also due to changes in migration. If you can believe it or not, migration is also down, and it's been down basically since 2015. It's harder and harder to attract and retain the best and the brightest. There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of international migration. So understanding how migration is going to shift also will impact this school age population. People always wonder about, do we really need migration? And it's really this demand for workers that drives migration to the state. So that's what's important in terms of understanding why population changes. And aging also creates this demand for labor, as there's this larger, faster growing group of 65 plus. There's more people leaving the labor force. Therefore, there's this demand for migration to the state to fill up jobs that people are leaving. So if we look at the total population change over time, this starts in 1970 and goes through 2023. The blue is natural increase, which is births minus deaths. The red is net migration, the ins minus the outs. The total bar is total population change. So what we can see is that especially recently, we have really slowed down from what we maybe saw in the 90s, which is really when the last time we saw a large population shift and growth in the state. And it's really been slow since before 2020. So it's not just 2020 that led to that population slowdown. And it's important to look at the three components of that. So the births, deaths, and net migration. So births are in the red. We reached our peak birth in 2007, currently making kind of our peak birth 18 years old. So there's fewer 17-year-olds, fewer 16-year-olds, fewer 15. You get the picture. So that's the red component. Green is the net migration, and you can see it goes all over the place. We saw lots of migration in the 70s, the 90s. The last large migration component was really in 2015. So the question is, where will we go from there? The blue is deaths. It's very easy to forecast. I will tell you, forecasting deaths is pretty easy because we die pretty normally, how we have historically. But we are narrowing that gap between births and deaths, which is really slowing down that net migration component. So births are down. In Colorado, births are down 8,000 fewer births per year than we had in our peak in 2007, 650,000 fewer births per year in the United States as a whole. So if we look at the map of the United States, red, orange, yellow, positive growth in the under 18 population over the last decade between 2010 and 2020. All of the shades of blue are states that had a decline in that under 18 population over that decade between 2010 and 2020. We had a decline of over 1 million people over that decade. And we can see it doesn't, Northeast, Midwest, California, declines in that under 18 population. Those are also our net migration states that send us the most people are from the Northwest, Northeast, the Midwest, and California. So this is a long run impact of this decline in that under 18 population. Since 2020, the under 18 population has declined by 1.4 million more kids. So if we look at 2010 to 2023, 2.4 million decline in the under 18 population across the country. In Colorado, in the map on the right-hand side, red, orange, yellow positive, shades of blue decline. We can see Eastern Plains, San Luis Valley, Western Slope, Denver Metro, all experiencing declines in that under 18 population. And over this next decade, between 2020 and 2030, we will experience declines in almost every single county in that under 18 population, almost every single county in that under 18 population. If we just look at the straight numbers, and I know you're probably thinking to yourself, ugh, don't want to look at the straight numbers, but if we start in 2010 and we look through 2050, this shows the change in that 5 to 18-year-old population. Blue is that the youngest population, the 5 to 11. Then we've got our 12 to 14-year-olds in the orange, and then our 15 to 18-year-olds in the green, showing that peak population of the total youth population, 5 to 18, peaked in 2019. We're not forecasting that to return to those levels until 2039 for the youngest population, and as the total population as a whole, not until 2041. If we look at when we're forecasting those numbers to return, those kids have not been born yet. So that's important to be thinking about, because there's a lot of uncertainty in that future births. This shows a chart of what we're forecasting in terms of births, deaths, and net migration out into the future. Births we are forecasting to come back, but only if we're able to attract and retain people in the state. And this assumes that we're able to, but then those births don't get back to that peak level that we had in 2007 until 2037. So that's there's a lot of uncertainty in that, a lot of uncertainty in the net migration, especially with recent transitions with the administration. Deaths are pretty certain. So that line is pretty well known. So just to tie things up, we know that births are down. Births are down in the US and in Colorado. Peak birth was in 2007, making that peak birth 18 years old. Total fertility rate has been falling over decades. So that's not new, but we are at a pretty peak, at a low that we've been at. Total fertility is about 1.5 in Colorado, 1.6 in the United States, and 2.1 is replacement. So definitely significantly below replacement. For births to return, meaning for school-age population to return, requires more women of childbearing age for that to come back. So a lot of uncertainty in terms of immigration, international immigration, lots of uncertainty in terms of migration to the state, just competitively within the United States as a whole. Can Colorado attract people within Colorado? Big picture, I think that we're probably going to start to see more significant declines in that under 18 population over time. So maybe a leading question would be the importance of education for future productivity. If we're going to have fewer kids, in my mind, we need them to be better. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it to the next person.
Very good. Thank you, Elizabeth. I wish we had more time to dig into that. That was some really, really interesting points. I appreciate that. So up next, again, hold on to your questions or just type those into the chat window. We're happy to address those as we go. But up next, we have Lisa Wheel. Lisa Wheel is a product of Greeley District 6 schools and the proud mother of 2 DPS graduates. Lisa is the executive director of the Great Education Colorado, which she co-founded with 4 fellow preschool moms in 2003. Before diving into public education advocacy, Lisa was a public interest attorney and a political consultant serving on staffs of a number of elected officials, including Colorado Senator Tim Wirth and Governor Roy Romer.
She's really old.
I don't know about that. She is driven by a belief that a vital, equitable public education system is the foundation for individual success, family well-being, thriving communities, a strong democracy, a just society, and a vibrant economy. And she has wicked sense of humor. So, Lisa, without further ado, let's turn this over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Andy. So I'm setting a timer because I am not known for brevity. The timer didn't work. So Andy, I'm setting you as the timer.
I got you.
I am going to do a really quick past, present, and future of school funding in Colorado. Just so you know who Great Education Colorado is, we're working toward a Colorado where every student can thrive and graduate ready to lead their best life. And what we do is we're working together in coalitions, networks, and with our own network of individuals to create a Colorado where every student can attend a public school that is welcoming and adequately, equitably, and sustainably funded. So this is where we are now. This is a graph that we've been updating for many years. We will not be anymore because apparently the National Center for Education Statistics is no longer in existence. But as you can see, the red line is where Colorado compares to the national average per pupil. And while we have made some gains in the last few years, we still remain about $2,000 below the national average, closer to $3,000 below when you take the cost of living into account. We are so clearly far below the national average. We have literally the least competitive teacher pay in the nation. What some people call the martyr gap is about 35% that teachers make less than they could make on other professions for which they are qualified. And now, if you've heard that we were fully funding schools last year, we're no longer taking money out via the budget stabilization factor. That just means that we are now funding schools at the same level that we did in 1989 after adjusting for the consumer price index, not even adjusting for the healthcare and pensions and energy costs that districts are having to deal with. It also, if you think about 1989, there were not computers. It was before we had standards. Before we got in 1989, we said everybody can come to school. It was before we started saying, and every student needs to leave being able to do the following things. So the costs have grown phenomenally. The funding has not. So that's where we are now. Where we are at this very moment is that even though they got rid of the budget stabilization factor last year for the first time in 15 years, the budget stabilization factor took $10 billion out of our schools between 2009 and 2024. In just the next year, suddenly we are in deficit mode again, and there's sort of a backdoor BS factor being talked about. So these are headlines from the Colorado Sun because the legislature, as you probably heard, is dealing with a $1.2 billion deficit. That deficit meaning the amount of money necessary to just keep up with inflation and case growth in education and prisons and healthcare. And so it is a really difficult budget and a lot of cuts happening now, not because we can't afford things, but because Tabor has come into play again, and we have given more than $10 billion back. You may recall that I said $10 billion has been cut from schools over the 15-year period. In the last 3 to 4 years, we have given back $10 billion to taxpayers because Colorado is not allowed to keep and spend all the money that comes in under our very low tax rates. If the revenue grows faster, then the legislature has to give the money back and then deal with $1.2 billion cuts. And so in addition to those cuts, we are now looking at what's going to happen with federal funding, not just for education, but for Medicaid and everything else as well, because when the federal funding for something is taken away, the general fund is going to have to get stretched farther. So we are looking at endless cuts. Get It Done at the bottom right of your screen is our effort to bring together a lot of organizations to tell the legislature, we expect you to fully and fairly fund our schools. That's not what I'm talking about today, but if any of you are interested, I'll talk about it. But now let's take a look at where we actually need to be. And there were 2 adequacy studies that were funded by the state to say what are the resources necessary to make sure that every student, no matter their characteristics and no matter the school district's characteristics, how much would it take to actually meet the standards that the legislature has set? And I'll go through this really fast because I can see I'm near the end. Class sizes are supposed to be 15 K through 3 and average 25 in through high school. There's supposed to be a tutor in every room. There are supposed to be more counselors and health professionals in every school. I'm sorry, tutors in every school. And the more students with special needs and in poverty and learning English, et cetera, the more of those adults you need in the classroom. There is an expectation that there should be extended day and summer school available. We have technology funding specifically for curriculum, after school, and electives. So you want a full class, want to have the right adults in the room in the school. We need to pay more teachers, and we need to pay teachers more. And so the question that comes up here is the need for closing schools and all the things that are happening here a result of having too few students and too many schools, or is it the chronic underfunding? Because if you think about the number of schools in schools, or the number of students in schools that may be considered too small, especially in the districts that are less affluent, they may be the right number of students if you had the resources to give them the opportunities that the adequacy study has identified they need in order to close all the achievement gaps and make it possible. So my answer is, of course, yes. It is all of those things. It's different in every district. Which of those three things? Too many schools, not enough kids, chronic underfunding. It's a different mix in all of them, but underfunding is critical, is a key reason for in each one. And there we go.
Very good. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it. I know that's a lot of information to get in a short amount of time, so I appreciate you rushing through that. Again, this will be recorded. You guys can go back and rewatch this again, because I'm sure that it's hard. I can't keep track of all of the great notes that they're doing right here. I'm not going to, for brevity's sake, I'm not going to read Clarence's full bio. It's phenomenal, but we can just touch on a couple things here. The CEO of Denver's Family for Public Schools. He's an advocate for foster and youth and underrepresented communities. First generation high school and UCLA graduate, and formerly the City Year Denver NPEBC. Passionate about equitable and high quality education. So, Clarence, I apologize that I'm not going to be able to go into any greater depth, but I would rather give you some more time. So, away with it, sir.
No, you actually bailed me out there, Andy, because my resume is not as impressive as Elizabeth or Lisa's. So I'm glad you actually sped through it.
Very good.
But appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, Daniel and Andy, for providing it. Critically important. As Andy mentioned, I have the great pleasure of leading Denver Families for Public Schools and have this chance to sort of take a lot of the topics and themes Lisa and Elizabeth already touched on and bring that down to city level, give an example of how that is playing out in Denver. But I think it's important to start with just a statement of fact that when we talk about declining enrollment, when we talk about school closures, it is not a logistical conversation, it's a moral conversation. And as Andy named, public schools being very close to my heart, a first generation high school and college graduate, I deeply believe that regardless of your race, your income, your zip code, how much money your parents have, every kid deserves access to a well-resourced, high quality public education. And so with that, today, this topic of declining enrollment and how it is playing out in Denver, this really starts to get more attention in our city and at the governance level in 2019. At that time, the school board and the district started to look backwards and see many of the national trends that were playing out across this country start to play out in Denver. And so just to anchor that in a few data points, in 2019, if you look backwards to 2007, you saw about an 18% decrease in the births in the city of Denver. And that actually is a little bit higher than the national average. I looked at it, it was about 16% over that time, so a little bit higher in decline in births. You add that to just the dramatic increase and also the cost of living in this city. And so housing gets a lot of attention, kind of starts the affordability conversation always starts there. In 2012, your average house in Denver costed about $236,000. Just as recently as 2021, that had more than doubled. It was 571,000 was the cost of the average house. So you had declining birth rates, you had the city getting more expensive, and that has a real impact on families. One of the things that I found really interesting in this trajectory of Denver is not just the birth itself, and you see that get a lot of attention when it comes to declining enrollment, but you look at cities, especially cities like Denver, where it has gotten more expensive over time. And what you see is also families, even if births are happening in the city, a decline in those kids 5 years later entering kindergarten. So in 2016, about 71% of kids that were born in the city 5 years earlier enrolled in Denver public schools. So usually you look at it as like that 5 year rate of how many kids are staying in the public school district is capturing. By 2021, that had declined to 63%. And I think you can anticipate if Denver continues to get more expensive, you'll continue to see that decline. So these were some of the factors in 2019, 2020, 2021, the district really started to pay more attention to in terms of declining enrollment and start to think about how are we going to address this within our system. But also you want to name within that, going back to that first point that I made, that any conversation about school consolidation, school closures, is not just a financial decision, not just a logistical decision, but it's really a moral decision. And so those decisions about what kind of city we want to be, about the impact that we're having on real people, students, their families, educators, and entire neighborhoods, those decisions have to be made with meaningful involvement of the people that are most impacted. And so in 2022, you saw the district bring forward a series of recommendations to the school board around closures. And ultimately, most of those were rejected. And when you really dug into it, we had heard within not just the school communities, but the broader community of schools, and then you go beyond that in the broader Denver community, was that there's just not a deep sense of community engagement and not a deep understanding about why these decisions were happening at that time and how those decisions were being made. And so the school board in 2023 brought forward Executive Limitation 18 or EL 18, which was meant to bring more clarity to that process, which we could dig into a little bit more. I know, sensitive to time here, I won't be able to go deep into a policy in this intro, but what you'll see is ultimately through that process, it called for both intensive community engagement from both the district and the board, and specific areas that were used within a matrix to identify the impact of declining enrollment within communities and make decisions about the future of schools that looked at things like building utilization, sustainable enrollment, the impact of things like academics within those schools, and more factors as well. It was fairly complex, but I'm noticing that I'm getting close to time and don't want the ditty to play me off. So let me round it out there and just say that that's a little bit of information about how these trends have impacted a city like Denver. And ultimately, EL 18 did result in another series of recommendations that came in 2023 that were accepted: 7 closures and consolidations and 3 restructurings of schools. And it continues to be a topic of debate for this district and board moving forward as we continue to face the impact of declining enrollment in the city.
All right. Thank you, Clarence. I appreciate it. Again, I know that it's a very large topic. You guys are all passionate about this and you don't have a lot of time. So I appreciate you guys condensing your talking points into as much as we can. So I appreciate your time and your insights on that, Clarence. Next up, we have Andrea Heights. Andrea Heights, again, I'm going to do the condensed version here to give you a little bit more time here, Andrea. She is currently the president of the Mesa County Valley School District in Grand Junction. She's an executive board member on CASB, experience in enrollment challenges, education policy. She's also a realtor and passionate advocate for student success. Andrea, it is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so kind of springboarding off of what Clarence talked about, we also have seen declining enrollment over the last 5 years, really springboarding in 2019. I may not have actually ran for school board if in 2021 if I knew that we were going to be closing schools. So just in full disclosure, because it's probably been one of the hardest things that we've ever done. And I'll go into that in just a little bit because like Clarence said, this is a really hard on school boards, your teachers and staff, your administration, and your community, your parents. It really does affect everyone involved, and it's really emotionally heavy, and it's been a real big learning experience for our board especially. So in 2019, our district here in Western Colorado, we had 21,000 students. We're one of the larger school districts between here in Denver, and we have now dropped by over 2,000 students, and we're continuing to decline, projected to be about 17,000 students by 2029. And this just isn't a temporary dip for us. Our out migration is really our families, and our in migration is really 55 plus. And so we're really seeing a huge demographic change, just like Elizabeth talked about earlier in her presentation. And we're seeing that even presented by our own health department in their demographics as well, because we're actually looking at our own industries here, looking at how they're having to change as far as what we're needing to attract to our own area as far as industries. The live birth data in our region is supporting this trend as well. We actually even just recently had a birth center that is shuttering down because of just fewer births that are happening in our area. So in 22, we shuttered our first middle school. And then in 23, we did a reorganization with another middle school. And then last year in 24, we shuttered 3 elementary schools. And so in the process of that, kind of like what Clarence talked about, we ended up kind of learning through that process. We established a declining enrollment committee, and all of this information is on our website at d51schools.org, and you can kind of see the whole process that we came up with. Our community, we had a really great collective of community of members, teachers, principals, parents, and we had a couple board members just as liaisons to listen. And we came up with different criteria for closing schools, but also criteria of what our community wanted us to look at as far as helping our district as a whole. And so, so we came up with both a policy on school closures to help our future boards if this ever came up again, and then also procedures of what we needed to do moving forward. And like I mentioned earlier, school closures really affect neighborhood schools and, like I said, the heart of the community. This transition was hard, and so we really came together on how we could support the schools that we had to consolidate, and then the schools that obviously would be receiving those kids and those communities as well. It's obviously a live and learn sort of lesson. We haven't done, I don't think there's any perfect way to do these things. I think it's a way that you have to kind of come around and communicate with those communities as best as possible. And unfortunately, don't think there's any perfect way to do this. You just have to try to communicate the best way that you can. From my real estate perspective, I will tell you, I've been in real estate for the last 16 years, doing residential initially and then transitioning to commercial. In the last 3 to 4 years, I've not worked with one younger family in purchasing a property here in our area. I've worked with a lot of families who have either college students or individuals who are purchasing homes for cash, moving from a lot of outside of the area, state-wise, purchasing properties here and wanting to live here for all the amenities of why we all love Colorado, but not really bringing in, school-age children. And so it's been really interesting to see both my work life, and then obviously I feel like my volunteer life with the school district and my role on the school board kind of merged together because of that in and out migration. And I've seen the two kind of collide together because in my work life, we've just not been seeing, I've been seeing the same thing happen and not really been seeing the families I used to work with early on in my career now actually happening, the same way that we're seeing show up in the school district area. So anyways, I know my time is about up, but I would say that the declining enrollment is really a multifaceted challenge. And with this broader demographic and economic realities, just like Lisa talked about, as school board leaders and all of us together, it's a challenge with the fiscal responsibility and the community sensitivity. So it's just something that I think we all have to continue to wrap our arms around, continue to bring the data into it and also the heart into it when we talk about it with our communities.
Very good. Thank you, Andrea. That was phenomenal. All right. Up next, we have Mr. Nicholas Martinez. Again, for brevity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and just go off the bullet points rather than the full bio. That is in, I'm sure we can get those to you if you are interested. But Nicholas is the executive director of the Transform Education Now initiative, former community organizer for DSST Public Schools, a middle school history teacher in Southwest Denver, an advocate for educational equity, marginalized communities, and a CU Boulder alum. Mr. Martinez, floor is yours, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for having me. One point of clarification, and this is completely my fault because I'm a terrible student and I forgot to send y'all the updated bio. A few years ago, I did change my name to Hernandez. There was some conversation in the chat about my multiple aliases. So just wanted to clarify that for folks. My name is Nicholas Hernandez. I'm the executive director, the founder of Transform Education Now. Our work is really about empowering families to make sure that they have a seat at the decision-making table. Whether it's school improvement, whether it's school funding, whether it's discipline policy, we're making decisions about other people's children. And it is a firm belief of our organization that families deserve a seat at that table to engage with decisions about their own children. And so our work is really about teaching families the ins and outs, the nuts and bolts of why we make decisions and how we make them, ensuring that families, when they show up after work, in between jobs, that they're able to have a productive conversation and really express their viewpoints, not just reiterate talking points, not just kind of regurgitate what they've read in the papers, things like that. So really that's our work, kind of in a nutshell. In regards to declining enrollment, I think unfortunately a lot of families find their way to us in moments of crises. Their children have IEPs, they have questions about whether their kids will continue to be served. They hear a lot of competing kind of narratives about what's happening in their school, and they turn to us through referrals to just have a conversation about the reality of what's happening. I think what we've heard from families over the last few years is a sense of just deep confusion, whether that's Jeffco, whether that's DPS, whether that's other places. I think this idea of we don't have enough money to fund schools, or we don't have enough money for all of these schools, is kind of a foreign concept, because frankly, how many of us have, before doing this work professionally, have ever sat with a school budget? How many people have ever read the School Finance Act and dived in deep with the expertise and some of the technical knowledge to be able to just kind of absorb all of that, right? I do this work every single day, and I got to make phone calls every day to smarter people to ask them questions about some of this. So, parents like my own, right? They don't have the time to be able to do that. They don't have the networks to be able to do some of that. And so really that becomes our job, is to demystify some of this. I think one of the questions that was posed to me in my 5 minutes was best practices. I think the number one thing we can do, whether it's about school closure, school finance, or anything else regarding schools, is be transparent and just be completely and bluntly honest with families. I think that is where we get mixed up. That is where we hit roadblocks. Sometimes schools close because we don't have enough students in them. Well, what do you mean we don't have enough students in them? We need to go dive deep into per pupil funding. We need to go dive deep into how schools are funded, how dollars are allocated, and frankly, what does it actually cost to run a school, and how do we measure that, ensuring that families have their heads around that. If you've ever spent any time with working class families, which is almost entirely the families that we serve, there's nobody that knows a budget like a working mom. And so if you tell her the budget that you have versus the expenses that are accrued by a school, they'll understand, they'll articulate to you oh, there isn't enough money for some of this, right? But I think school districts, school leaders, and elected officials like to play hide the ball a little bit with families and don't give them that full plethora of information and that full gamut so that families can deeply engage in some of that. So, any school leaders on the call or in the audience, right? Like the first thing I would say is like, just be honest with your communities and tell them, what are those gaps and what is those shortcomings looking like. I really did appreciate what Elizabeth had said about kind of the need for schools to be better, because the other part of this that hasn't come up yet is school quality, right? So many of the declining schools that are extremely small, not intentionally small, because I did hear that from Lisa, right? Schools that are intentionally built to be extremely small and are managing a budget that is meeting those needs, right? That means sometimes those teachers, unfortunately, are pulling double duties. We have a third grade teacher teaching fourth grade science as well, right? Those are intentionally built schools. What we're talking about is schools that were intended to be comprehensive, and because of budget, because of declining enrollment, have had to shrink. Those are not intentionally built small schools, right? What we've heard from families is they know they are being shortchanged, that their children are being shortchanged in the classroom, that they understand that at the end of this road with this school, that their kid is going to be behind, that their kids aren't going to hit those benchmarks that we all expect, those bare minimum floors that we have for our kiddos. They know that, right? And so families are making decisions based on quality and based on their own experience. And I know we're coming up on time, so the last thing I will say, right, is Elizabeth talked a little bit about like the cost of living in the state, and it's come up in the chat around gentrification. Part of this is an economic problem, right? If our students are not being prepared academically and are not reading in third grade, then they're falling behind, and it's compounding because we're not very good at catching kids up. And eventually we're graduating kids with diplomas who are unprepared to go to college, or unprepared to access high paying careers, who then can't afford a mortgage payment in their local neighborhood and are being pushed out. So a lot of this comes back, in my opinion, and in the experience that we've seen with families and what we've heard from families, is this gap in basic skills and in this basic opportunity to learn in our classrooms because of the lack of budget, right? And I'll be the first one to say, like, we need to repeal Tabor and all that, but at the same time, we need to do the most that we can with what we have right now.
Drop the mic. That was good stuff, Nicholas. Very, very good. I wish everybody had a few more minutes, but again, just trying to keep everybody on task with this. I really appreciate that. Some great points. Let's go right to our next guest, Mr. Joel Newton here. Apologize for that. Joel Newton is the executive director for the Edgewater Collective. He founded an organization to support local community assets. He's an experienced advocate for youth and family, a graduate of Arapahoe High School and Taylor University, as well as Denver Seminary. So, Mr. Newton, over to you, sir.
Yeah, so with our work, we're in Edgewater, and just a little context, we're just west of downtown Denver in Jeffco Public Schools. So our schools are majority Latino, majority of the students receive free or reduced lunch. And in a lot of ways, whatever's happening on the north side of Denver, those same demographic changes come to East Central Jeffco within a few years. So when we started our Cradle to Career Collective Impact Project in 2014, we really started to look at demographics and started to see even then a connection between rising rental rates and housing prices and a decline in enrollment in the 4 schools that we focused on. And being a collective impact project, we were really focused on not fixing the blame, but fixing the problem. And so bringing community partners alongside our schools to really see academic growth, but also holistic growth. And like Clarence said, in our schools, I do think we have a moral problem in the sense that our families have come to the United States with hopes and dreams for a better life for their kids. And the moral problem is that even though teachers are working hard, we're not graduating students ready for college or career. And so in our work, it's really been bringing partners along, looking at the data, and then responding to that data. So a few years ago, Jeffco Public Schools made the decision to close over 15 schools. One of our elementary schools was one of those. And we walked with our community through that hard year of helping families understand why the school needed to change. And the hardest part was helping families understand that because there were fewer students, it meant fewer dollars. And honestly, our students were not getting a great education at that school, even though hard work was happening. But it was a very hard process of walking families through that, because closing Mulholm Elementary felt like the closing of a family. I use the analogy of a divorce because that's what it felt like for our families. They were losing that school community, that school family. But because we had been watching the data, both academically and enrollment, we knew even though it was a hard decision, it was a wise decision for our students in the end, because they would have access to a better education in a school with more resources. Now, though, we're walking alongside our junior, senior high school, Jefferson, in some of the same process of Jeffco saying this high school doesn't have the enrollment that is needed to thrive. And so they came to our community with two options for keeping the building open and offering opportunities for career-based learning for our students. As we've listened to our community, we've taken a different approach with that conversation with the district in Jefferson Junior Senior, and really listening to our community and pushing our district to slow down the process. So instead of a 4-month timeline that would end at the end of April, with a district pushed and our community kind of being tugged along to the conclusion that our district wanted, what we're really pushing for is extending the conversation so that our educators, our families, our student leaders can be part of the conversation of what does student enrollment look like? What is that then in terms of student-based budgeting? How does that impact it? And really helping our community gain the knowledge they need to make the best decisions. And in a district like Jefferson County that is majority white, I think there needs to be real work done to create innovative solutions that help our Latino communities understand what's going on, give them real power in the decision making, and at the end of the day, bring in better educational resources for our students. I hear educators, families, students say, we want to keep Jefferson the same. But from my perspective, we need to keep what is working well, but also improve it, because there is a moral responsibility to ensure a great education for our students.
Oh, there we go. Got it. Very good. Thank you, Joel. I appreciate that. What reminds me is of that quote is that, change is the only constant. And families don't like change. People don't like change in general, especially when it's something that means so much to them. That's where I went to school. That's where my mom went to school. And now you're closing it. I mean, it is the moral problem, like you said, but it's also just there's a heart to all of these big decisions that are having to be made. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. Let's continue on here. We're getting close to getting back on track. I appreciate you guys being brief with your comments, even though we got a lot to discuss here. We're going to wrap up with Mr. Daniel Archuleta. Again, I'm going to do the fast version here. He is the president of Surpassing Distinction. He's also the co-designer for Revitalizing Colorado Family Communities, 20 plus years in education and nonprofit sectors, and he's focused on economic solutions and school closures. And he is the mind around this whole thing. He's the one that brought this together and had this happen. So we thank you, Daniel, for bringing together all of these wonderful people to have this very, very important conversation. So without further ado, sir, let you take it from here.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you to the my fellow panelists, as well as the audience here today. I'm excited to bring you some, just to talk about this pilot project called Revitalizing Colorado Family Communities. It's all about building family centers of excellence through economic stimulation. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So there's 3 things that you should really know about me. The first one is that I'm an analyst, so I'll just look at data, and I think there's always conversation to be had around data. 2, I'm a strategist, and then the third is that I'm a project manager. So let's In 2017, I created Surpassing Distinction, which is a mission-based for-profit organization delivering project management, solutions, and strategy impact and engagement. We have worked with for-profit, nonprofit, and public education organizations across the state. And the question is, why did we get involved in declining enrollment? In 2023, we were awarded a 6-month sole source contract to project manage Denver Public Schools concerning low and declining enrollments initiative. And what we found was the same thing that Elizabeth was looking at. 7 out of the 10 cases, declining enrollments were in areas where there were historical population shifts. But that's not the whole story. There are so many pieces to this, and each one of them is unique based on the location. So overall, what we're looking at in Colorado is that there's been a trend for increase of Colorado education legislation. And when that's combined with what Lisa was reporting for school funding, it means that there's more and more expectations with less and less to do it. We also do know that public schools are changing. The composition in 2010, 8.2% of public school enrollment was in charter schools, but by 2023 it was at 15.6%. And as Andrea had said, it's in the chat, it's not necessarily relevant to her community. And the future is unknown. There's more changes coming our way at the national level and at the state level. So what can we do? I think what we need to do is come together through collective impact and collective funding. And that's at the heart of what Revitalizing Colorado Family Communities is. We collaborated with 30 plus individuals and organizations to build a community-led, collectively funded, collective impact structure and process. The purpose is to resolve economic root causes, and they manifest in many forms. For our pilot project, we're exploring 2 symptoms. One of them is declining enrollment and school closures. The objectives: to funnel resources into communities through collective funding, collective impact, provide wraparound support for communities based on the unique needs of each community, to stimulate the local economy, to create family centers of excellence, and to maximize community benefits. That is not a guarantee that those schools and those communities will necessarily remain open. The model itself is simple. By lifting community voice, we will have a call to action. And the community mobilizers will do that work. These are the community trusted nonprofits, neighborhood organizations, and public agencies. They are contracted and partnered with to conduct needs assessment, asset maps, community engagement, and then to, at the final stage, implement the solutions. Surpassing distinction in this model is really invisible. They're the project managers and neutral facilitators of the process. They provide administrative services like contract management, mediation, data reporting, all to maximize that community benefit that takes the form of economic impact. The structure follows a similar collective impact structure, but we're not a backbone organization. But it would have a governing body across all of the communities, and then within each community there'd be a representative steering committee, and then the organizations who would be implementing the solutions would be community collective. So what makes this model different? 2 key differences. One, it is completely community-led. The district, rather than a manager, would be a partner, and the timeline is much longer than was traditionally in these processes. It is a 2-year timeline that's only possible through collective funding. In fact, for districts to participate as a partner, we would be seeking a 1 year of a small school subsidy offset. The entire process includes solution implementation as well as property decision. The community-led piece of it, it means that the representatives ensure continuous feedback directly with the community, identify and prioritize community needs, develop RFPs, develop collective funding priorities, and evaluate the implementation of community-based solutions. The timeline is broken up into 3 phases. 3 months where we convene the governing body and partner communities and receive collective funding for phase 2. Phase 2 would be 9 months where we convene the steering committee, resulting in the collective funding priorities, and receive that funding for phase 3. And then phase 3 is implementation by community collective and property, including property decision. The current status of this project right now, we're looking for partner school districts who want to take a risk on something innovative, but it really isn't a risk. We know that this works. I've been doing collective impact for 10 years. We're also looking for phase 1 funding. So that's my contact information, and that is my time.
Right on the money. I love it. Appreciate it. So we got through this as quickly as possible. We were hoping for like 15 minutes worth of Q&A at the end. We are down to 5. So, and I've done my best to kind of keep up on the chat window, but Daniel, I'm going to kind of defer to you. Did you see any questions in the chat window that were worth spending the last few minutes kind of talking about?
And I think all of the panelists go through there and take a look at if there was anything directed at you. What I was seeing since I was the last one is that a lot of the questions that were directed to some of the panelists were answered. If anyone has a question, as well as the audience, to repost your question, we do have a few minutes.
So while we're waiting for those to come in, I'll jump in here just again as a former educator in the Colorado school system, but also as a parent. So we've identified that the problem is very large. I know that everybody in this virtual room wants to do what's best for the school, what's best for the students rather, and what's best for the communities. That's not always an easy thing. And maybe we just do a roundtable real quick. What are some things that people can do after hearing this and to get involved to make a significant or to make it a potential change and improvement in this? I realize that's a broad question, but the issue is broad. What are some tactical, practical things that we as communicators can do?
Have more babies.
I'm done with that. But any other ideas?
I mean, I'm going to just pipe in a little bit from that have baby comment. Is I honestly do think it's important for people to understand what's going on in your community. You need to understand where the births are. Yep. Because you're not going to be able to fight that. I mean, we're fighting that throughout the entire world, a slowdown in births. So like all of a sudden thinking that you're going to inspire people and that it's a good idea to inspire people to have babies is an interesting conversation to have right there. But I think just being up to date with what's going on, because Jeffco's a great example, and I'm glad Edgewater was talking about it. Jeffco had their peak school age population in 2001, and they just started closing schools a couple of years ago. So that's, their motto was this marketing 101 side. They're like, you know what? We'll steal your kids from Adams, Arapahoe, Boulder, wherever it might be. Come to our great schools. Mm-hmm. And that's how they were able to keep their schools open for a long time, was by stealing kids from other places. And that's one strategy. But again, long run, big picture, babies are declining. Yeah. And so it's a fun balance. And I know we talked about affordable housing. Same thing. Sure, you can build affordable housing. That does not guarantee you're going to increase birth rates. So I don't want to be a Debbie Downer. But it's a balance of be aware, but also you can attract people to your area.
All right, I love it. Katie Zabek, you had your hand up. I'll let you go ahead and unmute, and you can ask your question.
I am really curious about the tension of equity when it comes to closing down really impacted schools and really impacted communities versus continuing schools in really impacted communities that don't have full resources, that may not be able to offer a full suite of courses because they don't have enough students. And so really curious, especially from our district and community partners, to hear your thinking on that tension.
Great question. Who wants to take that? Katie, did you have a panelist that was
Nicholas,
directed towards?
We can't hear you, Nicholas. I see you talking. You're unmuted, but.
Anybody else want to jump in while Nicholas is getting his
How about now?
Katie.
There we go. Gotcha.
Oh, there you go.
Yep.
Go, Nicholas.
Go
go.
Okay. Man, the universe is conspiring against me, I guess. I was going to say, I think one of the things we can do, Katie, to lessen the burden on impacted communities, and in particular marginalized communities who often bear the brunt of school closures, is maybe expand what we're looking for when we talk about schools, right? And we look at, what criteria might lead us to some of these decisions. I think in the early part of 2020s, no, that's not right. In like 2010, 2012, right? DPS kind of led the way in saying like, hey, we're going to authorize schools. We're going to authorize an entire family of schools. And every single year, we're going to evaluate our schools on whether they're meeting the promises to communities. And if you're not, we're going to intervene. And if you don't improve over multiple years, regardless of governance type, we are going to potentially have to close. We're going to potentially have to do some of this. That would alleviate some of this because there are, particularly in Denver, there are neighborhoods who are not marginalized communities, who are not working class communities, who are not students of color, who are attending schools that, frankly, I would never send my daughter to. And had those schools been on the table, that might have been a wholly different conversation on which schools got closed. And had we done that 10 years ago, we may not be in the dire financial straits that we are today. And so I don't think it's a fun conversation. One of our school board member from Mesa said that, you know, if I had to close schools, I wouldn't have ran. I think that's real. I think that's a real conversation every school board member has to have. But unfortunately, it's the hard work that we have to do. And if we are proactive, not in closing schools, but in identifying places where we have improvement and sometimes closing poor performing schools, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in today.
Right. Yeah. Very well said. Very well said. Anybody else want to jump in on that question? I think Lisa had her hand up as well.
That was just a comment on what can we do. There's a link to how people can get involved in the big picture of Tabor reform and bringing funding. Money alone is not going to solve all these problems, but without more money, none of these problems are going to get solved.
Very good point. Any other, we're a little bit over time. Any other parting thoughts here? We will get this posted and out to everybody. I'm sure that, you know, we appreciate all of those that are here, but we will give this as a recorded version that you can share out to your folks as well. But any other parting thoughts? Well, Daniel, you brought us all together here, sir, so I'll let you get the last word in.
I didn't have a script for this, but I'll put something together real quick.
I believe in you. Go for it.
I just want to say thank you for everybody for contributing your time, your expertise on this topic. And I hope that we as a collective can continue to work forward and progress into the future for the best interest of our communities, our students, and ourselves. Have a great evening or a great afternoon, everybody. And I will see you sometime soon, I'm sure.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks for joining us for this crucial conversation on declining enrollment and its far-reaching impacts on our communities. A huge thank you to our insightful panelists for sharing their expertise and solutions-focused approaches. Remember, lasting change begins with community engagement, so let's continue this dialogue. Be sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode to help raise awareness and drive action. Until next time, keep learning and empowering your community.